Welcome back to Learn Astrology with Mary. My name's Mary English, and this week we are interviewing Chris Mitchell, who is the author of this wonderful book, England's First Astrology Book, Roger of Hereford's Judicial Astrology. Now, Chris has done us a special favour by dressing up in some traditional costume today. So if you'd just like to tell us a little bit tell us about your costume, Chris, before we start.
Well, many years ago, I think it might have been 2008, something like that, Berkeley Castle used to have an annual festival called Joust for the whole family. That would include things like jousting, but they also wanted a series of talks on medieval topics. So they asked Bernard Eccles and me if we could give a talk on medieval astrology, which we duly did. And they said, could you do a bit of medieval fortune telling as well? And it's like, not quite sure what to do. It's a bit, the period involved was like 14th century. It was a bit too early for things like tarot. And Bernard said, well, I suppose we could do some horary astrology, but then that would be a bit boring because if you've got a queue of people, it's going to be the same chart for everybody. So we settled on doing something called geomancy, which is where you cast, it's a bit like the I Ching. It's a Western version of it where you cast stones or dice and create little patterns. So we did that and it was very successful. And Berkeley Castle wanted us to dress up, both to give the talks and to do the fortune telling. So they said, OK, we're going to make you a medieval astrologer's outfit. Any ideas what it looks like? And it's like, well, actually, medieval astrologers, it'd be a bit like saying, what's a 21st century mathematician's outfit look like? There's no such thing. You know, it was just everybody in universities did studied astrology. So we just wanted something that was sort of generally scholarly. And they came up with this. Bernard had a purple one and I've got this sort of orangey one, which I then bought off them because I rather liked it. And it's quite fun giving medieval talks in it. It's probably not terribly traditionally English. It looks more sort of Venetian to me. So the excuse I use is because Roger of Hereford was using Arabic astrology, I pretend that it was a gift to him from some caliph from the, from the Islamic world. But there you go. That's my story.
It looks lovely because you came round to my house once when we're with the the local astrology group, and you gave a talk to some people at my house, and it was very impressive because it looks really good in the flesh. It's all sort of velvety, and then you got a thing on your head as well with a little sort of bit coming off the side, and it's got a nap in it, so it's a material that's strokeable, is it?
Well, it's made, I think it's curtain material. It's really, really hot. And because I was doing the fortune telling in August, it was a bit of a nightmare. But it's pretty cold today, so I'm quite happy to be wearing it now. I did take it to Denver when I gave a talk to the United Astrology Congress in 2008. And that was quite amusing, really, because customs stopped me at the airport while they were just checking the case and had a look at this like really bizarre costume in there. I went, what's this? And I just said, oh, I'm English. And I went, oh, okay. I think they just assume that all English people dress like this. So there's no need for any further questions.
All English people are weird. So you've written this lovely book. So I saw you'd shared it on Facebook, England's First Astrology Book, and I immediately sent off to Amazon to get the copy. And I've had a good read. It is very, very interesting because it takes us all through the history of things. And so if you can give me a little bit of an outline of what it is that you're trying to do in the book, because you've said more than once in the book, and I love that you're giving the voice to Roger of Hereford, that you're allowing him to have a voice, because he'd written books but not many people know much about him, so this book is like bringing him back to life. So just tell us a little bit about Roger and where he came from. So obviously he came from Hereford.
Indeed. Well, my story starts 10 years ago when Bernadette Brady collared me at a conference and said, have you seen this amazing dissertation that an MPhil student at Cambridge called Nicholas White had written on Roger of Hereford? And she said, this guy, he's not an astrologer, he's an historian, but he found this manuscript with some really strange astrological techniques that none of us have ever heard of before. And this was taking place, in the West Country in England. Maybe here is a genuine English astrology that had never been discovered before. And she said, Chris, you have to go and learn Latin, do a PhD, translate this, get all that out there to astrologers. So naturally, because it was Bernadette, I said, yeah, all right then. So I did. And the end result was a dry as dust thesis that I produced in 2019 that's probably only ever going to be read by 3 people. And I thought, well, I haven't really
fulfilled. I've read it.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Good grief. Well, you deserve a medal for that, Mary. I don't think even I could read it, to be honest. And
I didn't read every single word. I did skip some bits of it. Yeah.
and I thought, well, okay, I've produced this, but I haven't really fulfilled my obligation to get this stuff out there to astrologers. So I wanted to correct that. And this book that I've just written is aimed not at academics, it's aimed at astrologers. You do need a background in astrology to fully appreciate it, but you don't have to be an academic. And it's written, as I say, for an astrological audience. And the idea being, well, there's all these techniques here that most traditional astrologers today in the 21st century probably haven't come across. Can you use them in your own practice? And yes, you can. So what I've done is translated his work so that you can actually use them and try them out. And what was unique about Roger is in the 12th century, there were lots of texts coming in from the Arabic world that were translated into Latin, but they were fairly tedious textbooks. And he was teaching a bunch of kids in the cathedral school at Hereford how to do astrology. And all these lengthy Arabic texts that go drone on and on and on about these are matters of the first house, these are matters of the second house, not very interesting. So he said, look, there's some basic principles here that's quite simple. Let's start simple and build it up, just like a modern teacher would do. And he said, nobody's ever done this before. I mean, all these techniques are available, but I'm putting them together for the first time into a single volume. So he was writing a textbook for his kids. It wasn't on all branches of astrology. This particular one focused on horary astrology and something called intentions, which is, what does the client really want to know? They might come along with a question for you, but what's really going on in their mind? And actually, they weren't new techniques after all. Bernadette based her statement on what Nicholas White had said in his dissertation, which he wrote in 1991. Back in 1991, we didn't have many translations of Arabic texts. There were only a handful. And so Nicholas White was saying, if I haven't seen it in Abu Mashar, then it can't be an Arabic technique. Whereas now we've got dozens of Arabic texts that have been translated into English, which makes it a lot easier to actually spot where Roger got his techniques from. He didn't invent any brand new ones. It would have been a bit odd if he had, really, because they were new to him. If you're just learning a subject, you don't say, oh, I think I'll make up a few of my own, because you don't really know what you're doing if you've only just come across it. And these would have been new to Roger as well.
And so the thing that's unique in this, you titled it, it's the first astrology book, but would he also have been the first person that was actually teaching astrology anywhere?
We don't know for sure, but probably, because we didn't have universities at this stage. He was writing in the 1170s. Oxford kind of existed as a university, but it didn't really get established for another 30 or 40 years. So he was on the cusp of cathedral schools and universities. Cathedral schools was where most learning took place. And this really confuses people, because you might think a cathedral school is going to be focusing purely on religious topics. But right from the very early days of Christianity in England, there were two types of school. There were song schools where people were taught, well, boys were taught to sing so they could do chant.
Gregorian chants, yeah.
But you also needed to be able to teach priests. And priests needed to learn Latin, so they needed to know Latin grammar and various other bits and pieces. They needed to know how to calculate Easter, which is quite complicated maths, in fact. They were taught at things called grammar schools because they were teaching Latin grammar. And so the grammar schools had a bit of a higher status than the song schools, because I suppose they thought anyone can be taught to chant, but not everyone can be taught how to do advanced mathematics and Latin grammar. So the grammar schools developed into cathedral schools, and instead of being run by monks, they were run by lay clergy. So Roger almost certainly wasn't a monk, but he was part of the bishop's household, and he was teaching kids astrology, which might come as a bit of a surprise to people today that think, well, I thought the church didn't approve of astrology. Today, if you look at websites, you will see that, the Catholic Church condemns astrology.
Even though they've got loads and loads of astrological stuff stuffed in the Vatican in their little museums and stuff, because I've seen some of them.
Oh, absolutely. Well, to their credit, they have put all of that online now.
Yeah.
So some of the manuscripts I've been working with, I got online from the Vatican. Protestant denominations condemn it. Most Islamic websites condemn it. Judaism is typically mixed. It's like, well, maybe on one hand, and other people say, well, yes, no, it is okay. But 850 years ago, everyone was doing it. It was Christians were doing it, Muslims were doing it, Jews were doing it. And in fact, the reason we can do astrology today in Western Europe is because a pope introduced astrology into Christian Europe in the year 999. So.
Yeah, and you mentioned that in the book as well. And then the other thing you mentioned is that, these kiddies are having to learn all this information. And, why would they want even to be learning astrology? But then how would they have used that themselves? So these particular students have learned how to do this intentions and orrery. Would they have gone off and done something with it, do you reckon? Or is it just a bit of the syllabusy type of stuff?
I think so, because Roger is absolutely blatant about his promotion of astrology. Even the Islamic authors who were enthusiastically translating texts in the 9th century still had to put a chapter in explaining why it was okay so that they could keep the clerics happy. Roger doesn't bother with that. Despite the early condemnations of the church, he just says astrology is the most excellent art. And the reason for that is it lets you see into the future, and that gives you power over other people. Well, that doesn't actually sound very Christian or very pious, but you can imagine that might pique the interest of a 13 or 14-year-old boy who would rather like to have power over other people and thinks maybe it is worth doing all this hard, complicated maths in order to be able to do this. So he was saying it's good because you can use it.
Oh, and that's the thing, you see, that's the thing that makes it the complicated maths type of stuff. I understood the basics of what you were talking about there, but there's no way I could have done any of that without a calculator. And I've said umpteen times, I could never have done astrology until computer programs were invented. I knew the principles of how to do it because my auntie was into astrology. She was born in the 1920s. But to be able to do the calculations for this latitude, and it's like, can't do it. Before I forget, there's a question I'd said to my podcast listeners that I'd like to ask you, and it's about time. So how did people even record time? Because obviously I'm also reading another, I've read your book, but I'm also reading another book at the moment called Astrology from Ancient Babylon to the Present by P.G. Maxwell Stewart. You might have heard of that.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Yeah, and he talks about time a bit in there. How do people record time? And there was somebody criticising astrology, Hippocrates or something, I can't remember who it was, saying that nobody would record the time of birth of this, and that people were taking their dogs to astrologers and saying, well, I know exactly what time the dog was born, can you do the chart? And then they'd check to see whether or not the chart was the real thing. But how did people back then, so we're talking, what year is this?
The 1170s.
1170s. So how were people recording time then? What were they using?
It's a really good question. I mean, because it was a cathedral school, they monks in monasteries obviously had regular prayers at certain times, and bells would be rung at certain times. So they knew when sunrise was, and they could actually work it out. So if the sun was coming up over the horizon, they would have been able to say to the nearest minute what the time was, except they didn't use minutes as such in those days, but they would have been able to measure it accurately. As for what about 3 hours after sunrise, because days in medieval times weren't divided into 24 hours. You had the day was defined as when the sun rose and night began when the sun set. So that period between sunrise and sunset was divided into 12. So at the moment, those daytime hours would be really small because it's coming up to the winter solstice now, and the nighttime hours would be really long. At the equinoxes, when the times were equal, then each hour would be what we now call 60 minutes. But in medieval times, you divided the day into 12 and the night into 12, and daytime hours and nighttime hours were generally of different lengths. So what they did do was, somebody like Roger would have had an instrument called an astrolabe, which was kind of like the smartphone of its day. And that would be used to measure the elevation of the sun. And you see this in an awful lot of texts, like when a king or when a prince is born, they don't say, oh, he was born at 3:15 in the afternoon. They say, when he was born, the sun was 25 degrees above the horizon. And they would do that by having their astrolabe, lining it up, moving the handle up until, well, you can't look at the sun. It's dangerous to look at the sun directly, but they'd have the sun going through a little hole in it and saying, yep, that's the right angle. Okay, the sun's 25 degrees above the horizon. That's all you need to draw up a chart. In fact, they used astrolabes to work out the time rather than the other way around. As astrologers today, I'd say to you, Mary, what time were you born? And I'd cast your chart. Back then, I might have said, Mary, how far above the horizon was the sun when you were born? And you might say, it was 23 degrees. And then I could say, aha, right, you were born at 11:20 or whatever.
Oh, okay,
But
right.
the astrolabe could be used for that. But it wasn't that accurate. And some of the techniques in Roger's book involve using the Lord of the Hour. Now, you're probably familiar with every day has a planet named after it. We've still got it in English. Saturday is named after Saturn, Sunday after the sun, Monday after the moon. If you speak a language other than English, we tend to use Norse gods for our days, but in French, in Italian, in Spanish, the names do still relate to the planets. So Mercredi is Mercury's day, and so on. And in Latin, it's really obvious because it's the day of Mercury is Wednesday, the day of Venus is Friday. But each hour was divided as well. So, for example, today is Friday, so it's Venus's day. So at sunrise, it would have been the hour of Venus. Now, the hour wouldn't necessarily be 60 minutes.
How do you get to it being Venus, being Friday? Sorry.
Oh, because Friday is Venus's day. In French, even today, it's Vendredi. Which the day of Venus. And in Latin, it was Dies Veneris, or Dies Veneris, they would have said in medieval times, the day of Venus. So the first hour of today would have been the hour of Venus. And then the next hour would have been the hour of Mercury, and then the hour of the moon, and then the hour of Saturn, in what we call the Chaldean order, which is the order of speed of planets. And that's Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon. And so the whole cycle just repeated. So at any time, you could, if you knew that it was the fourth hour of the day, you could work out what the hour was. But some of Roger's techniques say, if somebody comes to you and asks a question in the first third of the hour of Saturn, then the question in the back of their mind relates to conflict, for example. Well, in order to know whether it's the first, second, or third part of the hour of Saturn, particularly in winter when the hour might only be 40 minutes long, you've really got to know the time to within the nearest 10, 15 minutes. And they almost certainly wouldn't have done. So there had to be a bit of guesswork involved in that. And some of these techniques can't really work unless you've got an accurate clock. And they didn't have an accurate clock. The church bells wouldn't be good enough. They did have candles that they could use to burn to the regular rate. There were water clocks around, but they were fairly unusual. The Babylonians were very keen on water clocks. But again, they wouldn't have been terribly accurate. They had sundials. But to use an astrolabe to measure the sun above the horizon, you've got to remember he was teaching in Hereford. Hereford's on the Welsh border. It's not always bright and sunny in Wales.
Really?
Or Hereford.
Yeah. Okay. So astrolabe basically was the only way that they'd be able to make these as accurate.
Yes.
Right.
And he does say, you see all the notes on the manuscript, scribes have written, oh, this is because the sun was at an elevation of whatever. So they were using, you don't actually have to use an astrolabe. You could even use quite a primitive instrument. I mean, block of wood and the equivalent of a protractor would do the trick. But yes, they generally used an astrolabe for that. And Roger talks about astrolabes a lot. He assumed that everybody would have one that was reading the book. Now, we think of astrolabes as really, really expensive pieces of kit, and they are, if they're made out of bronze. But you could make them out of
balsa
wood, for example.
Yeah, that's what mine's made out of, balsa wood.
Yes, yeah. But that's not going to last 850 years, which is why we don't have many of original ones. The only ones we got that are original are made out of metal because they still survive. The cheap and cheerful ones wouldn't last very long, but they wouldn't be that hard to make if you were copying them.
And obviously you have to, with those, you have your latitude and your is it latitude or longitude you'd have to take into account? Because
mine's latitude, yeah,
mine's a London one, but I'm in Bath, which is 100 and something miles away, so I have to adjust it slightly because I'm a different. That's which way is what? So longitude's going downwards and latitude's going across.
You'd
is that
be
right?
okay. Longitude wasn't really a problem. It's only a problem now because we all run on London time, and we've got the Great Western Railway to thank for that, because in Bristol, people used to go and catch their train and find that they'd missed it because they were 10 minutes late. because the trains all ran on London time, and all the sundials and the local clocks in Bristol in the 1800s ran on Bristol time. And to this day, if you go to the Corn Exchange in Bristol, you will see that the main clock there has 2-minute hands separated by 10 minutes, because one tells Bristol time and one tells London time. But they didn't have that in Hereford. Yes, it was about 10 minutes different from London, but they wouldn't have cared. They were using sundial time. It was noon when the sun was as high as it could be. The fact that noon happened to be later than it was in London didn't really matter. So what was important was the latitude. And in Oxford, the University of Oxford, where they've got the Museum of the History of Science, and they've got all these old astrolabes, they've got a plate there from a Spanish designed astrolabe, but it has lots of latitude plates, and one of them is for 52 degrees north, and that works for London, Bristol, Bath. Well, it's technically Hereford, Oxford and Leicester, but it also works anywhere in southern England. So the extra degree doesn't matter. It would work fine in Bath, it would work in Bristol, it would work in London as well. So they did have a 52 latitude plate as a standard one.
You see, and the other thing that I was thinking about, having read your books, it's a lovely book. The thing I was thinking about is, there weren't many women involved in any of this then. It was nearly all blokes. I mean, women weren't educated. You were supposed to be busily popping out babies and stuff. But, all of this is sort of aimed at blokes. So therefore, there wouldn't have been too many women that wrote books then and all of that. But anyway, that's patriarchy or masculinity or whatever the word is if we want to talk about it. So there they are. They're learning under Roger. And I like the fact that he's called Roger of Hereford. So we don't even know do we know what his surname was? Would he have had a surname?
They didn't really have surnames back then, but he was also known as Rogerus Infantus, which is young Roger or Roger Young. And he makes a joke at one point that has confused scholars recently, because he says, I'm mucking about with computus here, which I shouldn't really do because this has been laid down by the church for centuries. And it's probably presumptuous for one as young as me to be messing about with it. So later scholars thought, he must have been a young man when he wrote this. When it's like, but earlier in the same text, he says, I've been sweating for many, many years at the cathedral school. He was probably in his 40s or 50s when he wrote that. And he was just cracking a joke that my name's Young and somebody this young shouldn't be playing around with things like this. But it wasn't young at all.
And the thing is, you mentioned also in the book that it was really important, if you were a Christian, to know where Easter was, because Easter isn't just, like a date. Like, for instance, certain signs of the zodiac, most of the time, certain dates. But to get Easter, it's got to be so many moons from I don't know, Lent or something, or the other way around. Can't remember, even though I'm a Catholic. And you'd have to know astrology. You'd have to have astrological knowledge, or at least knowledge of the moon and the sun and stuff to be able to do that. Is that right?
You need a knowledge of calendars, because the Christian calendar is a solar one. Christmas is always just after the winter solstice. But Easter is a tricky one, because the Gospels say that Christ was crucified on the eve of Passover. And Passover is a Jewish festival, and the Jewish calendar is based on sun and moon. So each Jewish month starts when you've got the tiniest little sliver of a crescent moon. It's the same with the Islamic calendar. All months start with a tiny little crescent of a new moon. The Jewish calendar adds extra leap months to keep the seasons in sync as well. The Islamic one doesn't, which is why sometimes you'll get Ramadan happening in summer and sometimes you'll have it happening in Easter, because it slips 11 days each year. The Jewish calendar doesn't. It more or less stays in step. So Hanukkah is always in the winter. Passover is always in the spring. So in order to celebrate Easter, the early Christians, a lot of them said, well, it has to be on the same date as Passover. And the definition of Passover is it's the 15th day of the first month of spring in the Jewish calendar. And the 15th day should always be a full moon, because each month starts with a new moon. So the 15th would be a full moon. So if Christ was crucified on the eve of Passover, it meant he was crucified on the 14th of the month. So the early Christians used to celebrate Easter on the 14th of the Jewish month of Nisan, which was the first month of spring. But then it was decided that was heretical, because they shouldn't be celebrating his crucifixion. They should be celebrating the resurrection. And since Sunday had become the holy day for Christians, that resurrection had to be celebrated on a Sunday, regardless of when Christ was actually resurrected.
Oh, okay.
And so they had the formula. Christians needed the formula. Well, we'll kind of use the Jewish calendar a bit, but we don't want to use what the Jews use, so we'll do our own version. So it was like, okay, you have to find when the spring equinox is. Then it's the first full moon after the spring equinox.
So first,
and then it's the first Sunday after that.
So astrologically, the first day of spring is the first day of Aries, yes?
Yes.
Right, and then they'd need to find 14 days after that?
No, they'd need to find the first full moon after, which might be the day after, or it might be a long time after. It might be 3 weeks after. And that's why Easter can vary by almost a month, because it's still the first Sunday after the first full moon after the equinox. And to muddy the waters.
So it's got to be the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the first day of Aries, yes?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, that's complicated.
But the waters are muddied even further because the early church were convinced that the equinox was on the 25th of March. And it wasn't. We would now say 21st of March, but of course it was a different calendar then. So it was about 6 days out from that as well. So it was really complicated. And this occupied Christians from the year 400 onwards when they were trying to work it out, because different areas would end up celebrating Easter sometimes a month apart. Some of them would say, well, it's that new full moon. No, it isn't. It's this full moon. And they were getting their Easters a month out. And you have marriages between kings and queens where the queen was celebrating it 1 month and the king was celebrating it a month later or a month earlier. And it all got really messy. And we have the Venerable Bede to thank for sorting the whole thing out, really. And
who's that?
How to calculate Easter.
The Venerable who?
The Venerable Bede. He was a monk who joined the monastery at the age of 7 in Jarrow. He was around in the 8th century. There was somebody actually a bit earlier than that called Dionysius Exiguus, who was a monk. And he's famous for inventing the Anno Domini system of counting years that we still use today. But he got his count wrong, unfortunately, because it's an attested, in the Gospels, it said that King Herod was king when Jesus was born. And we know that King Herod died in 4 BC. So it's a bit illogical to say Christ was born at least 4 years before Christ. Doesn't make any sense. So that's why academics write CE and BCE for Common Era and before the Common Era, because saying Christ was born at least 4 years before the Common Era makes sense. Saying Christ was born before Christ doesn't make sense. So it's nothing to do with political correctness. It's just to do with historical accuracy.
And so there you are. You're at the Hereford Cathedral School, yes?
Yes.
You've got Roger, he's teaching you astrology. He's going through all of this info for you. You might be able to be practicing it later on. And then you'll have to know all of these various different things. So you've got the intentions he covers in there. And then what does judicial astrology mean? Because that's the subtitle to your book. What does the word judicial mean?
It's judicial astrology is the science of making judgments. It's really what we would probably call horoscopic astrology today. So I'm going to look at your chart and come up with some judgments for it. I'm going to tell you something about your life. That could be natal astrology, or it could be you've asked me a question, so I'm giving you an answer based on the time that you asked the question, or you're saying, when's the best time for me to buy my new house? And I'll elect a time. So it's the science of making judgments, because astrology was also used for things like doing weather forecasting and so on as well. So judicial astrology is horoscopic astrology.
And so what would most astrologers have been concentrating on them? I mean, they wouldn't so much have set themselves up in private practice like we might do today so much. What types? So they'd be doing things like weather. What else would they be using their astrology for? Would they be answering the questions like you say, when should I get married? When should I start this business? When should I have a baby? Do they get those types of questions asked?
Well, they would usually be associated with a household, and it might be a royal court or a bishop's household or something like that, because astrologers didn't come cheap. And so you can imagine today in the 20th and 21st centuries, you had Joan Quigley was the astrologer for President Reagan. Penny Thornton was the astrologer for Princess Diana. So these are people that are quite high profile doing horoscopes for famous people. And they certainly wouldn't have been doing horoscopes for peasants. They couldn't be bothered with that. It was people like William Lilly later on who said, well, actually, poor people need to know where their missing cow is as well, even if they're not very rich, and I'll do that for nothing for them or for very little. But back in medieval times, no, it was only rich people that could afford proper astrologers.
And how would they have paid them then? Would they actually have given them cash, or do you reckon they paid them in kind? Not that you necessarily might know, but one's curious.
No, that's a really good question. I mean, if they're part of the household, they would have had quite a lavish lifestyle. I mean, Roger probably ate meat every day and had quite a nice lifestyle and drank fine wines and was able to travel a lot. And, people like Adelard of Bath was teaching Henry II when Henry II was a prince living in Bristol. And then he travelled to Sicily for 7 years and took some time off. And then he decided he was going to go to Syria for 7 years. Well, it's quite a nice job, isn't it? If you can say to your boss, I'm just off for 7 years. I'll see you later when I get back. But they did.
So it's the household. So some rich household like the whatevers, or the Medici family, if you're in Italy or whatever, and you're doing all the art. So you'd be part of that household, and then that's basically how you got your funding. So it's a bit sort of board and lodging type of thing, a bit like the Norland nannies live in. Well, mind you, the Norland nannies get paid a bit as well. They're not short on dosh. Oh, okay. So
I think they were a bit posher than that, because Roger of Hereford was part of the Bishop of Hereford's household, but it didn't mean that he lived in his house, because Roger had his own lands about 4 miles out of Hereford in a place called Mordiford, and the Hereford family still own that stately home in Mordiford that Roger of Hereford lived. Well, he didn't actually live in that home. It doesn't date from the 1100s, but he lived on that patch of land. They can trace their ancestry all the way back to him. And I was quite astonished that, although it's a little bit dubious, this oral history, when you go back that far, it does seem that the descendants of Roger of Hereford are still living there, at least one of them is. Bobby Hereford died in 2001 in his 80s, and one of his grandsons is Henry Hereford, who starred in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. So he's an actor and lives in Hollywood.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, they were rich then, and they're quite well off now. And so yes, it wasn't a mundane job being an astrologer. It was quite well paid.
Yeah. And it is a bit scary though being an astrologer, because in the other book that I'm reading is about some I can't remember, he was some sort of top knob, and he was getting astrologers to make predictions for him, but he lived at the top of a cliff, and if you got the question wrong, he'd push you off the edge of the cliff, and that's it, you were dead. And some particular astrologer, he turned up and he said, because this fellow wanted to be I don't know, king or something, and the astrologer said, oh yes, definitely you'll be king, and he said, I want you to cast a chart, what's going to happen to you? So apparently he does his chart and he goes, oh, it looks really dreadful, it looks as if I'm not going to make it to the end of today. And because he'd said that, then the chappie let him off and didn't chuck him off the edge of the cliff, because he predicted his own, but apparently he knew a bit about this before he went there. But it seemed quite a sort of razor edge existence to have. But what Roger was doing was a little bit more, because you say he's attached to the school, he's been funded by the school, he's part of the school, and still we don't know his date of birth though, do we? We haven't got a date of birth for him, so we can't even do his chart. That's so sad. Do you think you ever might find it out?
Or we don't even know where he died.
Right.
I mean, it's a shame, really. I mean, it does look like he possibly lived to a ripe old age, because there still seem to be references to him in the early 1200s, and he was already, at least middle-aged when he was writing this book in the 1170s. So it does look as though he lived to a ripe old age. And it was fairly safe, I think, being part of the bishop's household. I don't think the Bishop of Hereford really had the authority to throw people off cliffs. And Henry
lives in Hereford, but anyway.
He had some powerful patrons. Henry I was very supportive of the cathedral school at Hereford and was one of its patrons. And Roger was probably part of a circle of scholars in the West Country, including people like Adelard of Bath, who was teaching the future Henry II. So they were quite powerful.
Yeah, I was reading a bit about Adelard of Bath the other day, because there's a lady locally who's written a book and called him the first scientist or something. Because I thought yours was England's first astrology book, and she wrote a book called Adelard of Bath, First Scientist. But he studied astrology as well, or knew a certain amount of it. Doesn't get too much put on his Wikipedia page about it, but there is a mention of it. But he could draw up a chart and stuff. So it was really quite de rigueur for the day to be able to do that.
He translated. Adelard of Bath went to Sicily first of all, and then Syria, where he learned Arabic, and he translated Abu Mashar's introduction to astrology. The abbreviation to the introduction of astrology. And he also drew up loads of horoscopes, which we think were for Henry II, which he's left to posterity. We have Adelard's horoscopes. We have copies of them. So yeah, he was a practicing astrologer, definitely. And he was teaching astrology to the future King of England.
Wow, it doesn't happen today. I don't think Prince Charles or the Queen knows too much about astrology. Mind you, I'm always saying use the royal family's charts if you want to practice astrology, because at least we get a reasonably accurate birth time, unlike everybody else in the UK that doesn't have their birth time on their things. So tell me a bit more about the research then, because this is a whopping bit of research that you did. I mean, it took you years to do it, and then the book itself. So where did you start to get your first bit of information? Did you check out with the chappie that had written the first book, that the first bit of research that Bernadette was telling you about? Where did you begin all of this?
Well, I began by reading his to get a good overview of it. Now, Nicholas White, who wrote the dissertation, wasn't an astrologer, and he wasn't doing a full translation of the book or anything like that. He was interested in one particular horoscope in there to say, whose horoscope is this? And he concluded that it was the horoscope of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, I don't think it was, for various reasons, and I'm still in touch with Nicholas, and we just agree to disagree on this particular point. But I think there are various reasons that we can see that Roger made up teaching examples off the top of his head, just as we do today. I might be teaching a class of astrology students and say, okay, imagine that you've got, I don't know, a Uranus-Saturn opposition in Pisces and Virgo, and that's square to a new moon in Gemini, and let's say that we got Mars over there making a grand cross in Sag, and I'll draw this up, and I haven't bothered doing a chart for it. I've just drawn it on the board to illustrate a point. Now, if I'd written that on parchment and 800 years later somebody found it, they might say,
right,
he can't have been a 21st century astrologer, because this particular configuration didn't happen in the 21st century. It only happens every 310 years or whatever. And, so this doesn't make any sense. And similarly, Roger uses examples. One of the examples he gives is very detailed. He doesn't actually draw a chart. He just says, if Saturn's in the 5th house and it's the ruler of the fourth, and it's blah, 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 blah. When I tried to draw up a chart to illustrate it, was like, I can't get this chart to work. And eventually I had to set it for southern Argentina in order to get the chart to work. It only works on far southern latitudes, and he definitely wouldn't have had any clients in the southern hemisphere, certainly not the far southern hemisphere. So it was obvious that he was making up examples, and it was similar with this chart that he produced for here. I don't think he would have used a real person, because he was teaching a bunch of school kids. If you've got rich clients, you're not going to give away all the secrets by saying, oh, right, I had this really rich and famous person come to see me. Here's the chart, and I'm going to give you an example of what I think she was really asking about, because, they'd sack you.
Patient confidentiality.
They'd never use you again. So I think it's fair to say that his examples would have been made up. He definitely wouldn't have been using client charts with a bunch of school kids, because that would have been very unethical and not very good for his job prospects.
So that's your starting point. And then, so where else were you getting your research? Where did you have to go to get, you mentioned a little bit, where was it you said that you got some info from? The Vatican website, because they've got stuff there. So where else did you get all the info from? You must have read millions of books. I mean, your shelves must be full.
Well, there were 22 copies of this manuscript still in existence, spread across Europe. And in the early days, because I started this in 2012, it was quite hard. I mean, the first thing I had to do was learn Latin.
Tell me about that. How did you learn it?
Well, in 2011, I went on a Latin paleography course so I could read the scrawling handwriting that they have. And then I did an immersive Latin intense course at Keele University, their summer school, and tried that. And I still struggle with Latin. I mean, it's a long, hard, tedious progress, translating a sentence of it. Astrological texts are a little bit easier because they are quite formulaic. Saturn is cold, dry, dark, and so on. So it is just a list of keywords in some cases. And when he's giving examples, they're quite easy to follow, because it's like, if Venus is in the 5th house and Saturn is in the 6th, that's not too difficult to translate. So yes, that was the first thing. And then I went to Cambridge because they had 2 manuscripts there of the same text. And one of them, the handwriting was just so horrific. It was just
worse than a doctor's.
much worse than a doctor's. It was completely unintelligible. And I thought, I'm not going to be able to do this. And then I looked at the second manuscript, and that was a little bit more intelligible, but not that much so. Then I went to the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and they had a much more beautiful script. I can put share my screen. I'll put an example of it up, actually. So that's just an example, and you can see that's really quite beautiful handwriting. And it's not that different. I mean, the reason that we have a font in Microsoft Word called Times New Roman is Times New Roman was based on the kind of Latin scripts that they had in the 12th century. So you can probably see after this fancy S there, and it looks like you've got P and then lots of little lines. That's actually an abbreviation of prima, which means first. And the next word you can probably read parte. So if si in prima parte hore, okay, the R is a little bit fancy. Saturni, so if it's in the first part of the hour of Saturn, so you can kind of make that out. And I thought, oh, that's lovely. I wonder if I can take some photos of that. So I asked them, and they said, oh yes, you'll have to contact our reprographics department, and they charge £15 a folio, and there were over 100 of them. And I thought, well, I can't afford £1,500 just to look at one manuscript.
Wow.
They wouldn't let me photograph it, so that was really, really annoying. But then, so I then had to start looking at other manuscripts, and thankfully, quite a lot of them were online. I was kind of secretly hoping I would have to go to Paris and pick up a couple of manuscripts, but they were online. The ones at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France are online. The Vatican is online as well. They have loads of astrological texts. You sometimes hear these conspiracy theories that the Vatican keep them all hidden, but it's only because they're in Latin. You need to know what to search for, but they're all there and they're all freely available, which is great. And then the Bodleian changed their rules and said you can come and take photos of it and do that. So there's lots of his texts are in the Bodleian library in various manuscripts spread over the centuries. So I just went in and I photographed every single manuscript of his. There were, 22 altogether. I think about a dozen of them are in the Bodleian. So I photographed those dozen. Others I had to write off to various libraries. There's one in the public library at Dijon, and they were very sweet. They just sent me a facsimile of the thing, and somebody else sent me a CD. And sometimes they charged €30 or whatever, and sometimes they didn't. So I managed to get all 22, which was brilliant. The only one I haven't got, which nobody's got, is the original that Roger wrote, which would be lovely, the 12th century one. The one I
Do you think it might be stuffed in the cathedral drawer somewhere?
This is what I keep hoping. And I was looking through the chained library at Hereford and asking them if they had any hidden books that, you know, that they hadn't bothered putting out on display, but they don't have any record of it either. And so probably not. It might be in his family home at Maldiford. I'm going to try and go there once the pandemic's over and
check in their loft,
because it is open to the public, and I'm sure if I write to them, they'll show me around. So I'm hoping to do that. But
wow, if you found the original, I mean, that'd be the first edition, wouldn't it?
It would be a first edition. It would be absolutely amazing. But the one I just put up, 13th century, that would have been written about, we think, probably 1240. So about 70 years after Roger wrote the original. But that's the earliest one we've got at the moment, unfortunately.
So you had to read through all of that and then be able to make that easily accessible for us little bods out here. But you've done a lovely job. And what I like about it is that you've got the bits that are actually his, which you've translated into English. You've darkened those on the page, so we know that that's Roger talking, not you.
Yes.
Like the way that you did that, and the book's wonderful because it's got loads of charts in it, and you can follow through and you know, diagrams on how to do stuff. Where did I put that? Yeah, that was about the astrolabe. I've asked you about that. And then the medieval charts, because I've mentioned about this before in the podcast, and also when I'm teaching astrology, that back in the day they didn't always make charts that were circular. That was sort of you know, but the medieval ones were sort of square with bits on, and I think you've got one saved there on your desktop somewhere that you could show us.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll just share that and show you. So here, for example, is here are two charts. This one here is from the 14th century one. You can see that this handwriting is much more difficult to follow, the one on the grey paper. That's not very clear at all. This is from the Selden manuscript, which is the earlier one, and that's a little bit clearer. And you can see they're both drawn as square charts. We don't know if Roger actually drew the chart himself, because the text here on both of these says Jupiter is at 15 Cancer, etc., etc., etc. He spells it out, and some of the manuscripts don't have a chart in. They just spell out the positions of the planets. So whether his original one did or not, we don't know. It might have been a later scribe drew it up. And it's a little bit difficult to read to a modern eye because we're used to circular charts. So actually what I tend to do is I do actually do that with my charts and put them into and say, okay, let's put this into some kind of sensible thing. You can see on the square chart, it mentions Libra, Aries, and so on. The degrees are in Roman numerals, and then it has the name. So here we have Jupiter XX. So I've just put Jupiter at 20 degrees of Cancer, and so on. And we can put these in, and they've shuffled some of them into the next house. So Mars and the Moon are both in the 8th house, but they're close enough to the cusp that Roger has treated them as 9th house, and so on. So we can kind of see the techniques he's using. This is actually the only worked example in the entire text. He does give lots of other examples where he says, for example, if Saturn's in the 5th house and it's joined to the Moon in the 11th, then blah, blah, blah. But by and large, he doesn't give worked examples, but he probably would have done with his students. They would have had like a wax tablet or maybe some scraps of parchment and to draw examples on. And he could do worked examples that way, or a tray filled with, you know, wet sand or something where you can draw these out. Parchment's really, really expensive, so he doesn't want to waste it by drawing lots and lots of diagrams if he can actually go over those with the kids in his class, just as you would today. You know, you might have a textbook, but you're talking to your students and putting lots of examples on the whiteboard.
And like you say, you know, people then, paper was expensive, and it wasn't even paper, it was parchment, which sometimes was made out of animal skins and whatever.
Yeah,
wasn't necessarily out of paper.
No, this is all parchment. All the manuscripts I've looked at, apart from a 17th century one, which was written by Elias Ashmole, and the parchment is calf skin, and and you feel it when you're turning a page. The front side of it is smooth, the back side of it is rough, and they have verso and recto because one's hairy, one side's slightly hairy, and the other isn't. So
how weird! Yeah. They weren't very vegan then.
They weren't, but they lasted 850 years, and the ones that are written on papyrus, which of course the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans, I think the Romans used, most of them have disintegrated. And the Chinese had paper by then, but we didn't really have paper in the 12th century. That came about 100 years later. There are a couple in the Hereford Library that are written on linen, but that's very unusual.
So you had all the info, you did your dissertation, you got a PhD, that's right? Yes,
that's right. Yeah.
And now you've written the book. So what interest has the book brought up so far? So what's happened since you published it?
I've sold a few copies of it. I'm not sure whether I'll ever break even on it or not, because I paid a graphic designer to do the cover, which I don't regret because it's a nice cover.
It's lovely.
And I couldn't have done that myself. The rest of the publishing costs were zero, really, because I self-published. A lot of people say that self-publishing is vanity publishing, but I don't mind because I'm Leo rising, so I'm naturally vain, so that's fine.
No, it's not. It's self-publishing is different from vanity publishing. Vanity publishing is where you pay somebody a lot of money to produce a book, and then they've told you that everybody loves it and it'll sell millions of copies. Self-publishing is a very honest. Don't get me started about self-publishing because I've done both. I've been published and done self-publishing as well. But yeah, vanity publishing is something completely different where you pay thousands thousands of pounds for a book to be produced under the mistaken belief that loads of it will sell, and it doesn't. I mean, I had a relative that did vanity publishing, so a much ancient relative. His book's still in Bath Central Library, and that was 1700 and something, but that was different. He got paid loads of money from rich people to produce the bloody thing, and there's only, I don't know, 2 copies of it. Okay, so the book is written, and we will talk about where that's available from. So it's available from Amazon. So if I went to Amazon and I just put in England's First Astrology Book, your book comes up, doesn't it?
It does, yes. And it's available on Kindle and in paperback.
Yeah. And so you've got all of the charts there. You've got all about how to do it. You've talked about the judgments and intentions. And I liked the fact that you used the example. So somebody's asking about, you know, grandma's dying and you know, I'm really worried about it. And it's like, well, actually, what you're more concerned about is how much money you're going to make from selling a gaff type of thing. So I have to ask the question, how would you know that as an answer to the question when you've asked that? So you're checking that the question that the person has asked is about what they've asked about. Is that all to do with houses and rulerships and stuff?
Yeah. Now, in a modern astrologer will usually do a natal reading, but they might also draw up a chart for the time of the consultation to say, okay, I've got this person's natal chart. I've got a vague idea what they're about. I wonder how the consultation is going to go. So they draw up a consultation chart and go, "Ooh, I don't like the look of that Mars on the ascendant. This is going to be a bit argumentative, isn't it?" Or whatever. Now, you can't really do that with a horary one in medieval times, because they didn't tend to write the question and send it in advance as you would today. Today, you might email the question. So the astrologer has a bit of advance notice. They will turn up at your door and say, "Will my father recover from his illness?" And that's the question. It's in front of you. And you say, okay, it's the 3rd hour of the afternoon and it's the hour of Saturn or whatever. I'll do the chart. And then if you think, I wonder what's really in that person's mind, you can't draw up a consultation chart because it's the same chart. So the point is, he gives different techniques for doing it. He says the horary question you do by looking at the planet that rules the ascendant and the moon. That represents the person asking the question. What are they asking about? Father's illness. Well, okay, that's represented by a house. Illness is 6th house. Father is 4th house. I know it's 10th often 10th in modern astrology. It was 4th in traditional astrology. So if I go 6 houses from the 4th, that will represent the illness, and I just see if there's what's going on there. Is the illness stronger than the person, or vice versa? And then you can answer the question. But then there's another method for deciding what the technique is, and to do that, he gives us a different set of techniques. So I can give an example, which is, if I can share my screen again, he's got something called duodenaria. And it all sounds very complicated, but it's actually quite simple. Duodenaria is, we're used to, you've got the 12 signs of the zodiac. Well, you can divide up each sign into a kind of mini zodiac. So a duodenaria is just a 12th division of a sign. And what we can do is, he gives an example in the text where he says, for example, what you do is you look at what the rising sign is when the person arrives, and what degree is it in, and what duodenaria contains the ascending degree. Well, I'll just illustrate that very quickly. Let's say that when the person arrives, it's 11 degrees of Scorpio rising. Well, Scorpio is divided into 12 little 2.5 degree segments of Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, all in order. Yeah. So where's 11 Scorpio? There it is. It's in the duodenaria of Pisces. So what you then do is look and see what's going on in that particular house. And he says, so if the sign of the duodenarium were to occupy the 5th house, and in this example chart here, it does indeed, there's the 5th house cusp in Pisces. Well, that's the house of suns. And if the lord of that, well, that's Jupiter, is in the 4th house, that's the house of heirs, and yes, it is, you're going to consider the inheritance of sons. In other words, the person's come and has said, will my father recover from his illness? What he actually wants to know is, when am I going to inherit dad's cash?
Yeah, got you. Yeah, that was the thing that I was trying to get my head around. Thank you for showing me that and explaining it in more detail. So it's okay, yeah. And you've got in there as well an example chart, but you've also got all the little what do you call it now? All the little that chart there, that's lovely. Where are we now? So the essential dignitaries and stuff, that's useful. And then you've got all those extra little divisions as well, so that then you'd be able to work out what's the reason. Because today, when we started, Aries was rising, and the ruler to Aries is Mars. So in equal house, Mars is in the 8th, and the sun's in Sagittarius, which is a sign of knowledge and stuff. Which I think just as we started, I think it was in the 9th. Hold on. No, it's in the 8th, beg your pardon. And then the moon's in Leo today, and we've both got Leo ascendants, and the moon's in the 5th. So I did quickly draw up the chart for when we started the interview. Okay, so that was very interesting. So you could use that even today. So that's what you explain in the book. Great, fantastic. So it's
now Roger gets quite confused because he says, okay, intentions, you use duodenaria. Or you can use novenes, which is an Indian technique where you divide it into 9 instead of 12. Or you can use the Lord of the Hour. Or you can use the Part of Fortune. And he comes up with about 6 different techniques, all to do with intentions. And then he realises his students are getting confused and says, look, I know there's a lot of these. So how do you decide which one's the correct one? Well, you need to look at all of them, he says, and then come up with the judgment. So he tends to liken it to a court in a way. So let's say you're a judge in a court and you've got 6 witnesses, and 5 of them all agree that the person A started the fight, and the other one doesn't agree. Well, you're probably going to go with the consensus. You look which testimonies agree with each other. They're the ones that you give the most weight to. And actually, the reason it must have been confusing for Roger, because he would have thought, well, where have the Arabs got all these techniques from? But in fact, they have different histories. Duodenaria are a Greek technique, a Hellenistic technique called dodecatomoria. Novenes are an Indian technique called Nauharbat. There are others that come from the Persians. There are others that are Hellenistic. There are others that have arrived from all sorts of different authors. And when you look at the various Arabic sources, they all come up with their own pet one. And I think Mashallah puts them all together and says, well, you can use this one, this one, this one, and this one, and do it in this order. So it's quite interesting that the Arabic authors knew that there were lots of them, and they just decided to document all of them. And Roger was left with the problem of, how do I put all these into a book without confusing the heck out of everybody?
But at least you've got those other ones if you want, like, as you say, try them all and see which one works. But that's the same with everything really in astrology. You've got to try and find out what works for you, because if you did every single technique of everything, you'd be as confused as kerfuffle.
I think that's why astrologers were so expensive, because they did do every technique, and then they would say, right, now I've done these 10 techniques, these 8 all tell the same story. I'm going to throw the other 2 out because they don't. These are the ones that are telling the story. And chart calculation was just horrific in those days as well. It was really, really complicated. If you think about the ephemeris that you've got at the moment with 100 years in.
I have got one that belonged to my auntie. Hold on, let me grab it. Where is he? Where's my ephemeris? Oh, it's on the other. Oh, let me just grab it actually. Hold on.
Okay.
Ephemeris. Here it goes.
So which one have you got?
I've got, it's an old one now. So this is the New Waits Compendium of Natal Astrology by Evans. So mine's probably only going to go up to the year, where are we now? Mine goes up to the year 1970, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, so mine's very old. Goes up to 1980.
And when does it start from?
It starts from, because this one belonged to my auntie, and my birth date's written in there and my time, so I know my time of birth right. It starts in the year 1880, so it's 100 years, 1880 to 1980.
So it's 100 years ephemeris. Now, how many figures do you think are in that book?
Figures? Numbers? Bloody millions. I hate to think.
It's about 500,000.
Wow.
And you couldn't have done that in medieval times because there was no printing press. So you couldn't have written out by hand 500,000 numbers and then expected scribes to copy it accurately. So the tables that they had in medieval times are still quite long. They're about 18 sheets long, and they've got various calculations and so on, and it is quite complicated. But in order to work anything out, you have to do a lot of really, really serious maths. I'm not going to go into the maths, but if
No,
you
we
imagine,
haven't got the time.
let's say you're a 12th century astrologer and you want to cast a chart for somebody's birthday and they were born in 1130. Well, the tables that they've got, because they're Arabic in origin, all start from the Hijra, which was 762. That was when Muhammad left Mecca to go to Medina. And all these charts start from then, and they say, on this particular date, here are the planetary positions. Now, let's say that, Mars moves about half a degree a day. So in principle, if you know where Mars was on that date, you can work out where it is on the 15th of March, 1130. But you're going to run out of fingers, aren't you? Because it's like, okay, so 15th of July, 762, 16th of July, 17th. You've got to go all the way up to 1130 by hand, possibly using Roman numerals. You then end up with some vast figure like 189,000 days or whatever. And then you've got to multiply that by the mean motion of Mars. But you can't say, well, it's roughly half a degree a day, because Mars is going to have gone round and round the zodiac tens of thousands of times. So you have to do it really accurately. And they went right down to incredibly precise, millionths of a degree, multiply it by this big number, and then you keep subtracting 360 degrees from it to see where it is on that particular date. And that doesn't tell you where Mars is, it just tells you where something called the mean Mars is. Then you have to do some equally horrific calculations to take things called epicycles into account. It took me a week to do a simple chart using an Excel spreadsheet with these formulae in. They were doing it by hand. It was incredibly complicated. It's amazing that people were actually able to do it, because it is just horrific. But when you look at medieval charts, they're accurate to within a degree or two.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I have seen some old ones and I did compare them and I was thinking, oh, it's not far off considering. Yeah, because everybody's got apps now, and your app it's ridiculous how, well, mind you, some apps are wrong, but majority of them are correct, but you can calculate exactly where everything is. And we're spoiled. I mean, I never would have studied astrology. I've had to do it like my auntie did it and used the ephemeris. She says, well, I can't even manage to, I could draw the circle and I could do the ascendant. That's probably about it. But yeah, it was okay. So I can understand now that they'd be charging loads of money for that.
And even using an ephemeris is easy in comparison, because at least you can just look it up and read it off. And okay, it's a bit tricky with the moon, because if you were born at 8 o'clock, I've only got the position for noon and midnight, and I have to do the maths to work out exactly where it is. But by and large, you're all right for most planets. But no, not in medieval times. Each one would have been horrific to calculate.
Well, I'm glad I didn't live then. I never would have managed. Thank you very much for speaking with us today, Chris, and telling us about your book, England's First Astrology Book, which is available on Amazon. And we'll be back next week. So thank you very much, Chris, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you very much, Mary. Really enjoyed it. Take care then. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye now.